Hello, this is BBC News with the latest headlines for viewers in the UK and around the world. Questions over coronavirus antibody tests in England. They're being rushed out, according to a group of doctors. New York, New Jersey and Connecticut have asked people travelling from states where COVID-19 cases are rising to go into self-isolation for 14 days. The UK Housing Secretary is under pressure after documents reveal his close relationship with a Conservative Party donor whose housing scheme he approved against the advice of his own officials. The Met Police says 15 officers have been injured following violence at an unlicensed street party in South London last night. Around 2,000 management jobs are being cut at UK delivery service Royal Mail in a bid to save £130 million in staffing costs next year. Warnings over safety on what's set to be the hottest day of the year in the UK. UV rays could reach record levels. Hello and welcome if you're watching in the UK or around the world, and stay with us for the latest news and analysis from here and around the globe. I'm Anita McVeigh and you can contact me on Twitter about any of the stories we're covering at Anita_McVeigh. We start with the coronavirus pandemic here in the UK, where a group of 14 leading scientists and academics has criticised the decision to roll out mass COVID-19 antibody testing in England. In a letter to the British Medical Journal, they say the tests which establish whether someone has been infected are unable to prove immunity from coronavirus and offer no benefit, they say, to hospitals and healthcare staff. It adds that they have been rolled out without adequate assessment. Public Health England, meanwhile, said all tests had been extensively validated by the manufacturers. Our health correspondent Naomi Grimley reports.
Immunity remains one of the big mysteries of COVID-19. Even if you know you have antibodies, does that mean you're actually immune to the virus? And can you still transmit it to other people?
Sharp scratch.
Antibody tests are already proving popular, and last month the government said it had bought 10 million to be used on NHS England staff, as well as some patients who are having their blood taken and want to know if they've had the virus. But in a letter to the British Medical Journal, 14 senior academics question the wisdom of doing that. They're worried both about whether the tests have been properly assessed and whether it's a good use of resources, given that there are still so many unknowns.
There are lots and lots of problems with these tests. The first is they haven't been properly validated, and we've got very little data and understanding of what these tests actually mean. These tests are for research, and they don't actually tell you as an individual whether you are safe or not.
In response to the BMJ letter, Public Health England said it believed its evaluation of the tests was to a high standard. The Department of Health said that antibody testing will play an increasingly important role as we move into the next phase of our response to this pandemic. Naomi Grimley, BBC News.
New York State, for a long time the epicenter of the coronavirus pandemic in the US, has announced that it will quarantine arrivals from other US states which are experiencing a surge in infections. And they're not the only ones. Neighbouring states, New Jersey and Connecticut, are taking the same measures after bringing their outbreaks under control. We know that 8 states will effectively be cut off from much of northeastern America, including economic powerhouses Texas and Florida. All of them are in the south and southwest, and all have posted record spikes in infections in recent days, as David Willis reports.
New York, New Jersey and Connecticut were initially among the worst hit by the coronavirus, but recent weeks have seen a fall in the number of COVID-19 cases there. And in an effort to keep the virus at bay, the 3 states are imposing a 2-week quarantine on travellers arriving from some other parts of the country. 8 states are included in the quarantine order, some of which, like Texas, Arizona and Florida, have seen a dramatic increase in coronavirus cases in recent days after lifting lockdown restrictions.
This virus is risky enough on its own in terms of the potential to flare back up. So doing something common sense as this is, to say to folks, listen, it's time for personal responsibility. If you've been in a state that has a high infection rate, do the right thing. And that is taking 14 days and self-quarantining. It's the right thing to do. It's the common sense thing to do. It's the responsible thing to do.
New cases of COVID-19 in the US have risen to their highest level since April. Some southern states that were swift to lift their lockdowns have since seen massive spikes, with thousands of new cases being reported every day.
What we're seeing in Florida is really rapid transmission in that 18 to 34 age group. And you're seeing a lot of cases come up. And granted, they weren't being tested at this level a couple months ago, but I also think they're testing positive at a higher and higher rate. So clearly, you have a lot of spread there.
I stand before you today.
President Trump says coronavirus cases are on the increase because America is doing so much testing. And although some state governors are saying they may be forced to introduce new measures to combat the spread, the White House continues to insist the virus is going away.
Nobody is talking in some of these states about going into another economic lockdown and creating a pandemic within a pandemic, but we are in a much better situation now than we were previously in terms of dealing with the pandemic.
Meanwhile, the University of Washington is forecasting that the number of deaths caused by the coronavirus in the US could reach 180,000 by October. Currently, that figure stands at around 122,000. David Willis, BBC News, Los Angeles.
So New York has now gone from being the epicenter of the COVID-19 pandemic in the United States to a place trying to protect itself from imported infections. We asked CBS reporter Laura Podesta to outline how significant this turnaround will be.
Absolutely, a 180 from just a few months ago when New York was the epicenter. Now, New York, New Jersey, Connecticut, a lot of the northeastern states really have this virus under control, and that's why they're imposing this travel advisory to several of the southern states that have seen virus cases explode. And that travel advisory, as you just heard in that report, requires any visitors to self-quarantine for 14 days. And this is not unprecedented, we should say, because just a few months ago, Florida, Texas, a few other states were imposing these similar restrictions to travelers from New York and saying if you come and visit, you have to self-quarantine in Texas, in Florida for 2 weeks. So now the situation is flipped, and what New York's governor is saying is that New Yorkers, they really have to police each other. For example, if there's a New York businessman who's going to a New York office from Florida for just a quick trip, that those office workers should contact authorities and say this person is just arriving from Florida and they're not self-quarantining, they're here in a business meeting. So they're really asking for New Yorkers to be on the lookout and to make sure that they're stopping the spread by alerting authorities to those that are traveling.
Laura Podesta reporting. Sad news coming to us from the Scottish Highlands, where we are hearing that a 10-year-old boy has died after getting into difficulty in a loch. This was Loch Lubnaig near Callander, and this happened on Wednesday early evening. Emergency services were called to the loch after reports of a child experiencing difficulties in the water, but were unable to save the 10-year-old boy. They say there were no suspicious circumstances surrounding the little boy's death. We can only assume, we don't have all the details, but given the hot weather, obviously more people swimming in lochs, in the sea, in rivers, and obviously the message is there to take extreme care. Now, the UK Housing Secretary Robert Jenrick is facing mounting pressure to resign after he released emails and texts relating to a decision to grant planning permission to a £1 billion housing development in East London. Mr Jenrick's decision to approve the scheme, which was later rescinded, came the day before a local infrastructure levy would have added tens of millions of pounds to the cost of the project. The developer, Richard Desmond, subsequently donated £12,000 to Mr Jenrick's Conservative Party. Both men have denied breaking any rules. Well, let's take a closer look at the timeline of events between Robert Jenrick and Richard Desmond. The pair first met after sitting next to each other at a Conservative fundraising dinner on the 18th of November last year. Robert Jenrick admitted they exchanged phone numbers. And in a series of texts, Mr Jenrick said, "Good to spend time with you tonight, Richard. See you again soon, I hope." 2 days later, a meeting was arranged for December. On that same day, Mr Desmond sent a text in which he referred to a new infrastructure charge that was being introduced by the Labour-run Council of Tower Hamlets. That charge would have added millions to the cost of the proposed project. Mr Desmond's text said, "We don't want to give Marxists loads of dough for nothing." On the 15th of December, Robert Jenrick texted Richard Desmond to cancel their meeting as he needed to be in Parliament for the Queen's speech. Then, on January the 9th this year, the Housing Secretary urged approval of the £1 billion housing development. 5 days later, Mr Jenrick overruled a planning inspector and gave permission to build on the West Ferry site. A day before, a new infrastructure levy would have cost the developer an extra £40 million to build in London's poorest borough. And on the 29th of January, Richard Desmond donated £12,000 to the Conservative Party. The planning permission was rescinded, though, on the 22nd of May after Tower Hamlets accused Robert Jenrick of bias in his decision over his relationship with Richard Desmond. Let's discuss this with our assistant political editor, Norman Smith, who's at Westminster. So, Norman, the Prime Minister has said as far as he's concerned, this matter is over. But how much extra pressure do you think there is now on Robert Jenrick's position after the release of these texts?
Well, it's clear Robert Jenrick released all these documents and emails and texts in an effort to sort of kill off this story, to put everything out in the open, to say, I've got nothing to hide, there you are. Only, when we've gone through the texts and emails, it served just to further reignite the questions, the doubts, the controversy over why he seemed to have made himself so available and accessible to this wealthy donor, who also happened to be the man pushing a very, very controversial house building project in Tower Hamlets, which the local council were dead set against. And what we learned from these new emails is that after the two men sat together at a Tory party dinner, at which the developer, Richard Desmond, apparently showed Mr Jenrick a promotional video of the housing project on his phone. After that, after the dinner, Mr Jenrick stayed in touch with Richard Desmond, when in normal times he should have stepped back and had nothing more to do with the developer, to put down a sort of iron curtain between the two of them so there was no hint of any impropriety. Instead, he texted him to say, "Nice to meet you." Richard Desmond then gets back in touch and starts pressing for a meeting. Initially, the minister seems to go along with that before pulling back. So the first thing we learn is that the Housing Secretary chose to stay in touch with Richard Desmond, the developer. Many people would say he should not have done that. The second thing we learn is that even though his own officials in his own department said give this project the big thumbs down, he chose to give it the thumbs up. And the third thing we learn is that he wanted to rush approval for the deal through before a new community charge could kick in, potentially costing Mr. Desmond tens of millions of pounds. All of it looks bad. Does it prove wrongdoing? Maybe not yet, but it certainly has enabled Labour to revive the old taunt of Tory sleaze. Albeit this morning the Business Minister Nadeem Zahawi saying no wrongdoing here.
Robert Jenrick actually promised the Select Committee that he'll publish everything around this decision. He himself has said, look, with the benefit of hindsight, he may have done things slightly differently. He doesn't think that he was biased in any way, but the perception of bias that allowed this to happen was the reason that Robert pulled this application and allowed another minister now to determine it. In those messages you just read out, interesting two words. One, viability, and the other one, social housing. And Robert wants to see both things actually happen. More social housing being built, more housing being built at a viable development.
So it looks bad. Is there a smoking gun? Maybe not yet. That's a fire alarm, not a smoking gun. Sorry about that. I think the signs are...
Timing is everything, Norman.
I think the signs are, to cut it short, that Robert Jenrick will try to hunker down, and at the moment he seems to have the backing of the Prime Minister.
OK, Norman, thank you very much. Norman Smith in Westminster. The Metropolitan Police say they are investigating a large public disorder event which began overnight in South London. 15 officers were injured and 4 people were arrested on assault and public order offences in the clashes. Unverified images on social media appear to show police cars and other emergency vehicles being damaged by crowds in Brixton. Earlier I spoke to our reporter Sean Dilley, who said police responded to reports of an unlicensed music event.
There were crowds in the street around Cecilia Road in the Lambeth and Brixton area. When officers turned up, they described the crowd turning hostile against them and needing to bring in reinforcements. The crowds can be seen by some of that unverified footage posted to social media, being very hostile, in fact throwing things towards officers. Police vehicles being damaged. The Metropolitan Police have indeed now confirmed that that there were a few vehicles that were damaged. 2 of the 15 officers who were injured had to be taken to hospital as a result of their injuries.
And the police saying, of course, that what they were doing on the scene was to try to enforce the guidelines, the social distancing guidelines, to help prevent the spread of COVID-19.
Yes, we know that the Police Chiefs Council guidance is that people should engage in the first instance. It was a mass gathering. Apparently the crowd didn't respond to that, so they used something called a Section 35 dispersal order, so it's just an authorisation to clear the area. At that point it really did take a turn for the worse. We can see on social media from the unverified footage some of those scenes, but some people were apparently goading others on as they were smashing police cars and throwing missiles towards police lines.
Sean Dilley. The headlines for you now on BBC News. Questions over coronavirus antibody tests. They're being rushed out, according to a group of doctors. New York, New Jersey and Connecticut have asked people travelling from states where COVID-19 cases are rising to go into self-isolation for 14 days. And the UK Housing Secretary is under pressure after documents reveal his close relationship with a Conservative Party donor whose housing scheme he approved against the advice of his own officials. Now, could Vladimir Putin continue as president of Russia until 2036? Well, voting has begun in Russia on constitutional changes which would allow him to do so. If the public back the measures, Mr. Putin could be allowed to serve 2 more terms of 6 years in the Kremlin. Voting began a few hours ago. Because of the coronavirus outbreak, it will continue into July. The pandemic seems to have had an effect on Mr. Putin's popularity, as our Moscow correspondent Sarah Rainsford explains.
The coronavirus hasn't helped with that at all. Certainly some of the independent polling here has suggested that Mr. Putin's approval rating's down to around 59%, which, of course, in a Western democracy might not sound too bad, but it's not great for Vladimir Putin. And I think he's aware that things aren't going to get better here, particularly economically. The impact of coronavirus and oil prices are all having an effect, not just on the economy, but on the public mood. So I think that's why the Kremlin's so keen for this vote to happen now. Otherwise, you might wonder why on earth hold a vote in the middle of a pandemic. Mr. Putin already postponed this vote from April. It was supposed to happen towards the end of April. It's happening now. And in fact, because of the pandemic, it's been spread over an entire week instead of just one day. So there's early voting beginning today. People can head to the polling stations across the country from today. But the big final day will be on July the 1st. But I think what the Kremlin really hopes for this vote is that it can get as many people to turn out as possible, because this is really a vote where Mr. Putin wants the legitimacy, the mandate of a big turnout, people coming out in force to approve many changes to the constitution, including this key one, which would allow him to stay on until 2036.
Sarah Rainsford in Moscow. Now, as the hot weather continues, people are being urged to take care in the sun. The UK is expected to see record levels of UV radiation, with temperatures expected to reach a high of 34 degrees in London. Well, let's get more from our weather presenter, Matt Taylor, who's with me in the studio. Nice to see you
Hello.
Here rather than on the balcony or elsewhere. Matt, let's talk about those record UV levels that are expected today, because safety first. People really need to get the sun cream on, don't they?
Exactly. Exceptionally high levels, in fact, not usually seen in this part of the world. UV, of course, is ultraviolet rays from the sun. It can damage the skin quite rapidly, of course, if you spend any length of time in it. During the summer months here in the UK, the UV is measured on a scale from 0 to 12. In the UK, during the summer, it's usually around 6 or 7. We're expecting it to reach a level 9 through today, which is akin with the beaches of southern Spain. So it's
Why is that?
A number of reasons. Of course, we've just gone past the summer solstice, so the sun is higher in the sky, of course, for us. We saw an exceptionally large depletion of ozone in the northern hemisphere, caused by natural weather patterns this time round. High pressure's with us, that's keeping the skies clear, so the UV levels are not being interrupted by that. And of course, you've got to take in the fact we've been under lockdown. Industry, travel has been much reduced, and so level of pollutants in the atmosphere is a lot lower than it has been, and pollutants tend to scatter those UV rays a little bit. So all that has come together to cause what could be a day of exceptionally strong sunshine.
And the hottest day of the year.
And the hottest day of the year. Yes, we saw 33 degrees yesterday. Could get a degree or so higher today. What we'll notice today, though, the heat is more widespread across the UK. More across England and Wales will be above 30 Celsius. And in Scotland, the likes of Glasgow, Aviemore could get close to that 30-degree mark as well.
Wow. So if you don't like the heat, though, there is change, isn't there?
There is some good news. Things change through tomorrow. Big storms around, but this weekend, much, much cooler for all of us. And some rain, too.
OK, when I get home, I will be slapping on that sunscreen. Thank you very much, Matt. Now, around 2,000 management jobs are being cut at the UK's Royal Mail. The delivery service announced the restructuring in order to save £130 million in staffing costs next year. The company has reported a 31% fall in annual profits and says it will also reduce capital spending by £300 million across the group during the next 2 years. Earlier, we heard from our correspondent Sean Farrington, who explained a little bit more about the cuts.
Not surprisingly, Royal Mail are saying this morning that the impact of COVID-19 has meant they're having to cut costs quicker than they previously thought. They say this morning that 2,000 jobs will be going. The consultation will start today. Half of senior leaders will be included in that. So that's 2,000 management jobs. So we're not talking about the postal workers that many of us will see day to day in our lives. Now, the chief executive of Royal Mail is actually saying this morning that the business as a whole hasn't adapted as quickly as it should have done in the UK over recent years anyway. Falling letter volumes and increasing parcel problems has been a problem for Royal Mail, and that's been exacerbated by a coronavirus crisis. So even fewer letters and parcels becoming more dominant dominant part of that business. So they're going to start that consultation on that today. They're the latest in a long line of businesses now. Almost every week we're talking about a new big company that is announcing major job cuts, from British Airways to BP, Rolls-Royce, JLR, the owners of Frankie's and Benny's. It's getting into the hundreds of thousands when you start to tot up those job losses now. And Royal Mail are the latest this morning saying 2,000 jobs will be going.
Sean Farrington. German authorities in the state of North Rhine-Westphalia have reimposed lockdown restrictions in 2 districts after a spike in coronavirus cases. More than 500,000 people have been affected. One area is home to a meat packing plant where more than 1,500 workers have tested positive for the virus. Our correspondent Gavin Lee is in the German city of Munster.
The source of the outbreak is this company called Tönnies, one of the biggest in Germany. It's a place called Gütersloh, and that whole region is now one of 2 in lockdown. As you said, nearly 500,000 people. Tönnies reported turnover about 7 billion euros a year, slaughters 30,000 pigs a day, and has a workforce of 7,000 people, mainly migrant workforce from Bulgaria, Poland, Romania. 1,700 of them have caught COVID-19. Now, the workforce and the workers' accommodation sort of clustered together, high-rise flats and terrace houses as well. It's literally fenced off and under police guard right now. They are under strict quarantine. They cannot leave their premises. And what that means is you have local volunteers that we've saw with trolleys bringing in basic food for the next few days because people can't leave. Now, we heard many people shouting that they wanted to leave to go back, for example, to Bulgaria because they had children there. They said that they weren't getting paid from the company and they needed to get back to help the family. There are more questions, though, scrutiny on the company as to what went wrong here. Charities, including Caritas, have accused the company of exploitation of workers, of ignoring social distancing rule. And a video has emerged all over German media, David, of workers appear to be sort of cheek by jowl, sat together without any masks, any precautions, but the company have denied any wrongdoing, they've denied the exploitations. They do acknowledge, though, they say, full responsibility for this outbreak and have apologised.
Gavin Lee reporting. Now, it's been a month since George Floyd died while being detained by police in the American city of Minneapolis. The killing triggered global protests, led to some changes in laws and the removal of symbols and statues seen by many as celebrating racism. But why did George Floyd's death have such an impact when so many other tragedies seem to go unmarked? We asked 3 generations from one African-American family to explain.
It happens all the time, but people don't get to see it. Everybody saw this. I saw this, and it really just sucked all the air out of it. My name is Leonard. I'm 73 years old, and I am the uncle of Dwayne.
My name is Dwayne. I am 49 years old, and I am Nigel's father.
My name is Nigel. I'm 16 years old, and I live in Las Vegas, Nevada.
When I saw this happen with George Floyd, I started to have flashbacks about the things that were happening when I was growing up, when I was old enough to realize, what was happening. And I got extremely emotional. It started to take its toll. I'm sorry. And that's the problem I have now. I have that emotional thing that gets stirred in me because I've seen this all of my life. 73 years old, you say, wow.
My first reaction to it, just like you, Uncle, was I was in shock just because of that situation could potentially happen to me, you, or my dad, considering that you guys look exactly like him. It just made me very cautious and more aware of my surroundings to try and prevent being in those specific type of situations.
He and I have had the talk many times, the talk that every Black parent has with their children about what to do when you're approached by the police. I struggle with that because it just makes me wonder, how can you tell your son to cower down and submit and cover up and submit in a way that I think is unnecessary without filling him with rage?
And that's a hard thing for me to see my nephew having that same conversation with his son. I never had it, because of the time that I grew up. You had your separate water fountain that you drink from. You had your front and your back door entrances. You had places where you weren't allowed to go because the laws were set in place to keep you out.
They teach a small portion of it in history class, but you have a better connection and you can understand better. Me personally, I can consider that my uncle had to go through it. And honestly, it wasn't really that long ago that all of this type of stuff was happening.
I've been a fire captain for the last 15 years. I've been called the N-word by people that I was there to help. And only now, since George Floyd, there are conversations that are going on.
My generation is just a little bit more open to change, because I know many of my personal white friends, they are all in, they're posting on their Instagram pages explaining the inequalities that are going on in this world.
White people are listening to us based on what they saw happen with Floyd. People are listening to you, and they're hearing the things that we've been saying for 400 years. We've been crying for freedom. We've been crying for justice, because our lives do matter. I look at young people like Nigel. This is where the change is going to take place.
People are standing up to injustice and making change as far as legislation, with politics. It's going to take things like that, exercising our right to vote.
But I feel like as my generation, we just need to all come together.
I am hopeful. I hope that this movement continues. I hope that it doesn't let up until change comes.
Well, for parents, racism is an issue they've had to address with their children, not just now, but for many years. Anita Whitaker has 4 sons. She's been campaigning for better education to try to ensure a future where they're not judged by the colour of their skin. Anita and one of her sons, Khalil, join me now. It's really good to have you with us. Good morning to you. A lovely wave from both of you. Hi there, Khalil. Hi, Anita. Let me begin by asking you, Anita, in the month since George Floyd's killing, what sort of conversations have you been having with your sons? Because they range in age from 26 to 8, so I'm guessing slightly different conversations depending on the age.
I can say that, honestly, the conversations I've been having have been the same exact conversations I've been having for years. What's happened with George Floyd is not new to us. It's something that we've been aware of, and as a parent, I've been continuously trying to ensure that my sons are aware of these things that are happening and how to deal with those. What we've been having conversations about recently is more about what our next steps are now that a lot more people are aware of what's happening.
So you feel that this is going to make a change? What's happened to George Floyd and what's happened since then is going to make a change?
I feel like it's already started to make changes. I think that there have been so many other issues that have happened over the years, including Trayvon Martin, that haven't made the impact that's happening now. I honestly feel that because it was COVID and everybody was still and watching, that it hit more people emotionally, and a lot more people are starting to take direction, starting to listen and starting to learn by reading various books and making actual steps.
Khalil, you must be very proud of your mum, and you're one of 4 boys, as I say. Talk to us about your experience of racism, Khalil.
Well, I've been stopped before, and the police officers' reasoning for stopping me was that they'd heard that some black children had been going about robbing kids at knife point. At the time, I had like really bright orange hair, and I was in my school uniform. I've been discriminated against by certain people, accused of stealing, and then once I've proved that I haven't gotten anything, there's still been like a level of mistrust. I've experienced little things here and there through all different parts of life, whether it's school, outside, in workplaces. So yeah, no, it's real.
What are you doing? I believe you're involved in, you're studying politics at school. I think you're involved in activism in school to try to, begin conversations about racism and to make people think differently. Tell us more about that.
Yes, well, I mean, yeah, for years I've kind of been badgering on about racism. I'm proud to say that, a lot of my friends do trying to educate themselves about it and are trying to make positive change. And I think just now I feel like a lot of people don't think it's real just because they haven't experienced it personally. So, I do try quite a lot to explain to people who maybe haven't seen it, how it does exist and how it has affected lots of black people's lives.
Anita, what Khalil is saying there, a lot of people have said up to now that just because they haven't seen it or they haven't experienced it, they don't think racism is out there. Do you think that's changing? Because, listening to the conversations since George Floyd was killed, reading things since George Floyd was killed, it seems to me that is changing.
Definitely, I do see the change. I do see that it's been difficult for people to fully understand when you haven't experienced it yourself. And at times that it's felt that when I've spoken up or when Khalil has spoken up, it's as though, it's kind of in your imagination. But now that it's been put out there for the world to see, I think more people are actually recognising those little things here in the UK that are the microaggressions, those little things that are hidden, that actually cause issue for black people to move forward.
When you talk about microaggressions, can you give me any examples?
Oh, goodness. I'd say one example of that Khalil went through in primary school was when he was specifically told he had to draw a picture of Adam, Eve and God, and that he had to colour them peach because God made people in his likeness. Now, to tell a 10-year-old that starts to make them question who they are and what that means to them in the wider community and what that means within faith.
So there needs to be a reworking of the education system, doesn't there, to not come from a position of purely whiteness?
Yes, I think that what I'd like to see change is an introduction of not what people call black history, but recognising that by omission, by removing the blackness from history, that is the problem. I'm not looking for a gimmick or a bone to be thrown my way. What I want is that if we're discussing World War II, that we recognise and acknowledge those that have been involved from the Caribbean, the soldiers that came from the Caribbean, the soldiers that were active and part of World War II. If we're going to discuss what's happening in colonialism, we need to discuss actually how the impact of that and what that meant to black people and why the Windrush generation were here, for people to understand that actually they had British passports and they were British colonies. So they thought that this was the motherland because they were British.
OK, Anita Whitaker and Khalil, thank you both so much for talking to us today, 1 month on since George Floyd was killed. I'm also joined now by Julia, a mum of 2 daughters. She's joined by one of them, Kayla, talking to us. Julia and Kayla, hello to you as well. Really interesting to talk to Anita and Khalil about their thoughts over the last month. Sounding positive that things are changing this time, that the death of George Floyd, the killing of George Floyd during the pandemic, when people were paused and looking out at what was going on in the world around them, that is making a difference. Do you share a similar outlook?
Yes, I totally agree with what Anita was saying. We've got to start somewhere, and definitely it needs to start in schools, and especially then going into employment. Some of the employees still don't recognise the need to speak to black people and how they can, get people to develop. So it's very important that, especially starting off in schools, it will make a difference.
Kayla, I wonder what discussion has been happening in your school since the death of George Floyd.
We've been set quite a lot of work on Black Lives Matter movement. And yeah, they're trying to help us understand what it is, what it's about, and how we can help.
And looking at the slogan on your T-shirt, embrace the past, address the present, change the future, what do those words mean to you?
They mean a lot to me, because I got this shirt from my school for Black History Month, and it's just explaining everything in just 3 lines.
It shouldn't just be a month, should it? It should be part of the ongoing discussion.
Yeah.
Julia, I don't know whether as a mother of daughters you feel more or less worried than a mother of sons, as they go about their, daily business?
Well, I've always informed my children that they have to work the hardest that they can, and there's nothing in life that they can't do. I was always told as a young person, as a young black woman, you can't do mechanics. Why should you go and do mechanics? That's a man's job, and at the end of the day, that deterred me from doing probably a job that I would have wanted to go on and pursue. So I've always told my children, whatever you want to do in life, you go and do it, and I will support you 100%.
That brings us full circle, finally, to where you began, with education being at the root of change. You firmly believe that's where it needs to come from, through the education system.
Definitely. I mean, it's important. Anita was mentioning about going to primary school. When why should a child have to colour in a person in a certain colour? It doesn't make sense, especially if you're not from that background. We need to educate the schools about our culture, and we also need to educate them about our ethnicity, and it's so important.
OK, Julia and Kayla, thank you so much for talking to us as well today. Now, morbidly obese patients are twice as likely to die from COVID-19 than those who aren't overweight. That's according to research by Public Health England. Campaigners say the pandemic should be seen as an opportunity to help those living with the condition. Fiona Trott has sent this report from the northeast of England, which has the highest number of obesity-related hospital admissions in the country.
It was a bit frightening because I thought, what is the correlation between obesity and COVID?
You start listening to the reports and you listen to people who are overweight and more at risk, and then that makes you think that, how serious this pandemic is.
We know obesity is strongly associated with deprivation, and so it's no surprise that the North East, which has high levels of deprivation, has also got high levels of overweight and obesity.
Her first walk alone during this pandemic. Michelle knows she's at risk and has been afraid to go out. During lockdown, she's also gained weight, and that worries her.
This is the furthest I've been from home by myself. It's been very hard. Getting fresh fruit and veg at the supermarkets, it's a lot better now, but at the beginning it was very difficult. My husband would go and do the shopping, forget items, and having to go down the next day. It's a lot easier ordering takeaways. Plus, with me stress and anxiety, I do a lot of comfort eating, but I know it's got to stop. It's got to stop.
Michelle isn't alone. The North East has the highest rate of obesity-related hospital admissions in England, and almost a quarter of children starting secondary school are obese. Ben used to weigh 20 stone.
I never really know what time I'm going to get in from the football, so it's dead easy to pop in a takeaway and get a Chinese meal, or call in the fish and chip shop.
He lost weight through a fitness programme at Sunderland Football Club. The pandemic makes him want to lose more.
I think it's got to make you think about your lifestyle and changing things. And I think the pandemic to me it's changed me in a way that I didn't think I would change, but I have. And being locked in the house is horrendous. So I think the exercise was an excuse to get out the house as well.
Helping people lose weight is something a local NHS trust is trying to do. It was so concerned about obesity, it appointed a specialist consultant in public health.
Obesity is complex, so many factors go into it. Not just the clinical aspects, but the social environmental factors, which mean the NHS, the hospital on its own, can't address this problem. It really does need everybody pulling in the same direction, so that's central government, but also the NHS, local authority and communities themselves all working together towards it.
Hi Caroline, how are you?
But campaigners say the government hasn't done enough.
2 years on and nothing has changed, and these policies have been left to languish and are no closer to becoming reality. And in the meantime, the number of children and adults living with obesity has increased. And this should really be a catalyst now for the government to finally step up, take some action and help create an environment that makes it easier for everyone, adults and children, to be healthier.
The Department for Health says it's working with local councils to tackle child obesity and has made huge progress already by cutting sugar from half of all drinks on sale. Being vulnerable to COVID-19 has changed Michelle's outlook.
Coming out of the pandemic, I feel the future for me is positive, it's bright. I will lose weight. My grandkids are still young and I want to be there a long time for them.
An update now on some disturbances that happened in southeast London in the Brixton area last night. Unverified social media footage shows crowds of people attacking emergency vehicles, including police vehicles, in what was an unlicensed music event. Police said that they were called to. They arrived at the scene and tried to encourage people to leave in order to keep to social distancing guidelines, but then the problems followed on from that. The Metropolitan Police now updating the number of officers injured in that incident to 22 officers hurt. The Home Secretary Priti Patel has described the events in Brixton as utterly vile scenes and has said she would be speaking to the Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police immediately. Let's take a look now at some of the day's other news. Testing for COVID-19 is being stepped up in the Australian state of Victoria following a fresh outbreak of the disease there. 1,000 troops are being deployed to help with testing and to monitor quarantine programs at hotels for returning travellers. 3 men in the US state of Georgia have been formally charged with the murder of Ahmaud Arbery, a young black man who was shot dead in February while out jogging. His case went largely unreported until video emerged of the killing more than 2 months later. The Australian airline Qantas has announced plans to cut 6,000 staff from its workforce as a response to falling business during the coronavirus pandemic. It also said it won't be flying its Airbus A380 fleet for up to 3 years. The chief executive of Qantas, Alan Joyce, said there were no other options.
We have to position ourselves for several years where revenue will be much lower, and that means becoming a smaller airline in the short term. But the collapse of billions of dollars in revenue leaves us with little choice if we are to save as many jobs as possible longer term. Many of the 6,000 job losses we've announced today are people who have spent decades here. They're people we know personally. They are people that we know for a long time. Separate to the 6,000 job losses, about 15,000 people will remain stood down for some time. People from whom we have no work, but we will have work for them in the future.
The boss of Qantas there. The headlines now on BBC News. Questions over coronavirus antibody tests. They're being rushed out, according to a group of doctors in England. New York, New Jersey and Connecticut have asked people travelling from states where COVID-19 cases are rising to go into self-isolation for 14 days. The UK Housing Secretary is under pressure after documents reveal his close relationship with a Conservative Party donor whose housing scheme he approved against the advice of his own officials. The lives of hundreds of sick Palestinians are being put at risk because of the latest downturn in relations between their leaders and Israel. Last month, the Palestinian president said his government was giving up on past peace agreements because of Israel's plans to annex parts of the occupied West Bank. That decision stopped cooperation on many security and civil matters, including medical travel permits, as our Middle East correspondent Yolande Nell reports.
Myra's in constant pain. Cancer has blinded her in one eye, and the tumour's spreading. She needs an Israeli permit to leave Gaza for specialist surgery abroad. But the Palestinian office that should help her is no longer working. She's my daughter, not a dog. She's a child, her mother Mariam says. Where are the children's rights, the human rights? Last year, it was crowded when we visited this cancer centre at a Palestinian hospital in East Jerusalem. Today, each empty seat represents someone who couldn't get here. Palestinian leaders have stopped cooperating with Israel because of its plans to annex land they want for their future state. But when it comes to medical care, that's leaving their own people suffering. Anyone coming for treatment from the West Bank or Gaza must have Israeli permission and security clearance. Those from Gaza, which is ruled by Hamas militants, face the tightest restrictions, and hospitals there lack equipment and drugs. Without the Palestinian Authority making the connection and paying the bill, hundreds of people are stuck. But in this children's ward, there is some positive news. Osama has leukemia. Dr. Salami and the team here worked around the clock to bring him from Gaza with his mother. But they can't do that for every patient.
I spent 2 hours talking to many people to explain how it is critical and life-saving for this child to reach to Augusta Victoria Hospital. So it's not easy, and I can say that if this child didn't get this referral, he will die waiting for, one day is critical for acute leukemia.
Doctors say he now has very good odds of surviving. Meanwhile, other Palestinian patients, like little Myra, remain unable to get treatment, caught up in the politics. Yolande Nell, BBC News, East Jerusalem.
Representatives of the UK's 40,000 driving instructors are calling for driving lessons to resume. Other than emergency training and tests for critical workers, tuition and tests have been on hold since the start of lockdown, as Tim Muffet reports.
Over the past 12 years, Chris Benstead has helped hundreds of people pass their driving test. Now he's being driven to despair.
I never knew it could be this bad, and we're just not hearing anything. So what we need information, we need some kind of guidance so that we can plan.
There are more than 40,000 approved driving instructors in the UK. The vast majority are self-employed. Lessons and tests have been stopped. So too have incomes.
What should have been done better, do you think?
If we knew where we were, instructors could have gone out and done some work, found jobs. And at the moment we can't do that. And most instructors have been hanging on. I don't think it could get much worse than this. We're just given nothing. And I think we're going to lose a lot of very good driving instructors.
Joe is 19 and has cerebral palsy. Lessons in his adapted car are banned. He can't book a test.
Living in a rural area, the public transport is not accessible. This and both my parents work. So this means that until I pass my test and have driving lessons to be able to pass my test, I will not be able to get out and have a sense of independence. My future, my career is on hold, and it's quite scary and daunting, and my confidence has probably gone quite downhill.
Throughout the pandemic, driving instructors have been able to give lessons to key workers, providing they've already got a test booked. But for some, that's raised even more questions. Is it ever safe to give a driving lesson or not?
We'll do whatever we feel we can with regards sanitising and wearing masks. But even some of the insurance companies have questioned the safety of wearing a mask to be able to communicate, especially when there's background noise.
Sasha works in a care home. As a key worker, she was offered a driving test, but couldn't get to it.
The only centres that were offering it were London, Birmingham, and I think it was Manchester. So you have to get to it. I don't obviously drive. We don't have a car in my household, so it's like public transport's the only choice. But then we're told only go via public transport if you really need to. I'm currently on a half-hour walk from my workplace, whereas a drive is probably like 5 minutes. And it would just make it easier. I could probably take more shifts to help out, especially on an early. I'd probably take some earlies if I could drive, because it's just a couple minutes up the road then.
The Driver and Vehicle Standards Agency oversees tests and tuition in England, Scotland and Wales. It told the BBC that it will announce the next steps with theory and practical driving tests and driving lessons imminently. Meanwhile, a plea from the organisation that represents driving instructors.
I would like to urge parents and pupils to not try and negate the need for a driving instructor because you're so worried about the risk of being in their car. Because what we don't want to do is create the other public health risk of improperly trained candidates going to the test centre and maybe, just maybe, getting through the driving test on mum and dad's training. But that's not what we're supposed to be preparing them for here. We're supposed to be preparing them for a lifetime of safe driving.
For now, instructors and learners are stuck, waiting for the green light. Tim Muffet, BBC News.
The surge on stock markets since April and recent steep sell-offs have meant a roller coaster ride for the thousands of private investors trading at home. Interest in day trading has been booming as people have time on their hands and no shortage of apps allowing them to buy and sell via smartphones. It's caught some Wall Street professionals by surprise, as Samira Hussain has been finding out.
Did you ever imagine that you would get interested in trading stocks?
Oh no, never.
Kelly Mills works in the film industry, but once COVID-19 hit her home in New Orleans, she found herself out of work and with a lot of time on her hands. After playing a video game which involved buying and selling fictitious items, she thought, well, why don't I try my hand at the stock market?
I'm not trying to make money. I'm just trying to spend my time because I have nothing else to do.
A recent survey showed 55% of Americans have exposure to the stock market, but much of that is through retirement and investment accounts managed by professionals. A new range of apps and no-fee trading options is making it easier for everyday Americans to buy stocks themselves.
Professionals here on Wall Street, well, they haven't been so receptive to these newbie investors, especially those that were able to take advantage of the big plunges on financial markets earlier this year. Many institutional investors didn't invest in March and April at the height of the COVID lockdowns.
Retail investors shoved their way in and have made a large part of the returns in this market, which is great from the retail investor perspective, but has been kind of frustrating for Wall Street professionals. And frankly, they don't like it, and they want to say it's a sign of irrational exuberance, when really it was just intelligent picking of a market bottom.
Eric Sutherland is using money he would normally spend going out with friends to trade on the stock market. He is also new to day trading and is not at all surprised Wall Street doesn't like it.
They don't want us to trade ourselves. They want us to give them our money so they can trade and make money with it. So of course they're going to be against it.
You know, right now I have the time to be on my phone all of the time, like constantly watching what's going up, what's going down, doing new research and everything. But when I go back to work, no.
That's the real mystery. Will these new investors stop actively trading once life gets back to normal? Or will the pandemic have made a fundamental change to those who play the markets? Samira Hussain, BBC News, New York.
We are hearing that the Environment Secretary has told the House of Commons this morning that the outbreaks of COVID-19 at 3 meat processing factories in England and Wales are thought to be linked to canteens and car sharing schemes. George Eustace said the government would issue new guidance to plants to try to stop further spread. And of course, we've been talking about the 1,500 workers at a meat plant in Germany testing positive for COVID-19 as well. You are watching BBC News. And it's time now for a look at the weather forecast. Here's Matt Taylor.
Hello there. Exceptionally strong sunshine for some of you through today, and it's a day in which heat and humidity will be more widespread across the country, but it will peak today if you're not enjoying the heat or the sunshine. Things looking fresher and a little bit wetter at times this weekend. But certainly this afternoon, temperatures more widely into the 30s across England and Wales. And in Scotland, the likes of Glasgow, Aviemore areas could get close to around 30 Celsius as well. But I've mentioned the sunshine. It's exceptionally strong across the south. Levels close to record breaking, I think, for some southern parts of England and Wales. The sun as strong as it would be in southern Spain rather than here in the UK. And that means a shorter amount of time before damage is done to your skin. And there will be lots of sunshine around for most of you today. A bit more cloud and some heavy thundery showers in the Western Isles of Scotland. A few cropping up maybe in the southwest later. But it's through this evening and overnight they'll develop more widely across the west. Could be torrential in places with large hail and gusty winds. 1 or 2 developing elsewhere as we continue with the humid conditions tonight into tomorrow morning. Like this morning, 1 or 2 of you will be waking up to temperatures to start the day at around 20 Celsius. But, as I've hinted, tomorrow will be a day of change. Things will gradually turn fresher, but to get there will be some hit-and-miss torrential thunderstorms. Pinpointing exactly where they'll be, always difficult, but we will likely to see some across western Scotland to begin with, and then break out elsewhere across the country during the day, mainly going from southwest to northeast. But there will be some of you, in fact quite a few of you, who miss out on the storms altogether and stay dry. But it will turn fresher in the west, temperatures dropping a fair few degrees relative to today. Still humid in the east, and still the potential for 30 degrees across parts of East Anglia. Bigger change though comes through Friday night and into the weekend. Low pressure will be circulating to the northwest of us. Bands of rain sweeping around that and some fairly gusty winds. Introducing Atlantic air, sweeping away the humid conditions that we've had. So a fresher start to Saturday. All of us will see rain at times. A bit more the way of dry weather, I think, across the south. More persistent rain later on, Northern England, Scotland and Northern Ireland. But note the temperatures, not into the 30s anymore. Mid to high teens for many. Low 20s in the south and east. And that fresher theme continues into Sunday. The most persistent rain will be in western Scotland. Showers for Northern Ireland, Northern England, North and West Wales. Drier the further south you are, but all of us seeing temperatures much lower. 15 in Glasgow, 20 in London.